Hey there, night wanderers. Welcome to The Sleepy Activist, where we uncover the hidden stories of resistance, solidarity, and collective power that changed the world one restful night at a time. Tonight we're settling into the longest, darkest nights, the Great Depression years of the 1930s. We're not looking at this era through photographs of breadlines and dust bowls, or through the lens of presidential leadership and New Deal programs. We're sitting at kitchen tables with families who lost everything, standing in factory picket lines in the bitter cold and organizing in communities where hope seemed like a luxury no one could afford. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy easing into sleep through stories like this. Drop a comment below and let us know where and when you're watching. Are you curled up in bed, grateful for the security you have, listening in the quiet hours when worries about tomorrow feel distant? Or maybe you're somewhere far away, understanding too well what economic precarity feels like. Tonight's story isn't about the collapse of Wall Street or the failures of capitalism writ large. It's about ordinary people. Factory workers who became organizers, housewives who became activists, and neighbors who became lifelines for each other. It's about how the very worst of economic catastrophe brought out both the worst and the very best of human nature, and how the solidarity forged in those desperate years created the social safety net we still rely on today. So, let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and let's travel back to 1929 to a small industrial city in the Midwest, where a young woman named Dorothy is about to lose everything she thought was secure and discover a strength and purpose she never knew she had.
Dorothy is 24 years old in October 1929. Newly married, working as a seamstress in a garment factory. Living in a modest apartment that feels like a palace compared to the tenement where she grew up. Her husband Frank works at the auto parts factory, bringing home a steady wage that seems to promise security, maybe even prosperity. They're saving for a down payment on a house. They talk about children. The future feels possible. The stock market crash on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, seems at first like something distant, something that affects wealthy speculators, but not ordinary working people like Dorothy and Frank. They don't own stocks. They have a small savings account at the local bank. Their wages, their jobs. They think they're insulated from Wall Street's problems. They're wrong. Within 6 months, Frank's factory cuts production by half. Within a year, it closes entirely. Dorothy's garment factory reduces hours, then wages, then starts laying off workers by seniority. Dorothy, being relatively new, is among the first to go. By late 1930, they're both unemployed, with savings dwindling rapidly and no prospects in sight. This is the experience of millions of American families. The Depression doesn't arrive all at once like a disaster. It creeps in gradually, cutting jobs and hours and wages, emptying savings accounts, foreclosing on homes and farms, until suddenly you realize the world you knew has disappeared and you're living in something completely different, something harder and meaner and more desperate than you ever imagined possible. By 1932, unemployment reaches 25% nationally. But in industrial cities like Dorothy's, it's closer to 40%. That means nearly half of all workers have no jobs, no income, no way to support their families. And there is no unemployment insurance, no social security, no food stamps, no safety net of any kind. If you can't work, if no one will hire you, you depend on charity, on family, on neighbors, or you starve. Dorothy and Frank move out of their apartment when they can no longer pay rent. They move in with Frank's parents in a small house that now shelters 3 generations. Frank's parents, Frank and Dorothy, Frank's brother who also lost his job, and Frank's sister with her 2 children after her husband abandoned the family when he couldn't find work. 8 people in a house designed for 4, sharing resources that barely feed 4, trying to maintain dignity when everything is stripped away. The shame is almost worse than the hunger. Frank, raised to believe that a man's worth comes from his ability to provide for his family, sinks into depression as rejection letter after rejection letter arrives, as the lines of men seeking any work grow longer, as his savings and then his father's savings disappear into the endless need for food, for heat, for survival. Dorothy watches her strong, capable husband shrink into someone she hardly recognizes, defeated by forces beyond any individual's control. But Dorothy discovers something in herself during these dark months. Where Frank internalizes the failure as personal, Dorothy recognizes it as systemic. This isn't happening because they're lazy or incompetent or morally deficient. It's happening because the economic system has collapsed, because factories are closed, because demand has evaporated, because the wealthy who caused the crisis are protected, while ordinary workers absorb all the suffering. This recognition that the depression is a structural failure, not a personal one, becomes the foundation of her political awakening. If the system has failed, then the system must be changed. If individuals can't survive alone, then collective action becomes necessary. If the government and business leaders won't act, then ordinary people must organize to force change.
The winter of 1932-1933 is the worst. Unemployment continues climbing, banks continue failing, businesses continue closing, and the Hoover administration continues insisting that prosperity is just around the corner while doing almost nothing to help. People are freezing in their homes because they can't afford coal. Children are going to school without breakfast, without lunch, without adequate clothing. Families are being evicted and having nowhere to go. Dorothy watches her neighborhood transform. Houses that were always maintained now show peeling paint, broken windows, overgrown yards, not from neglect, but from poverty, from people too exhausted and hungry to keep up appearances. Families double up, then triple up, packing people into spaces too small, because the alternative is sleeping in the street. Men stand on corners looking for day labor, willing to work for almost nothing, desperate for any chance to feel useful and bring home some money. But alongside the suffering, Dorothy witnesses remarkable acts of solidarity and mutual aid. Neighbors share food when they have it. Families take in children whose parents can't feed them. Communities organize soup kitchens, clothing exchanges, informal support networks that keep people alive when official channels fail entirely. Dorothy becomes involved in organizing a neighborhood mutual aid network. It starts small, women in the neighborhood sharing information about where to find day work,
which landlords are most lenient about late rent, which stores will extend credit. It grows into something more structured, a rotating fund where families contribute what they can when they have income and draw from it when they don't. A community garden on vacant lots where vegetables supplement inadequate diets. A childcare collective that allows mothers to seek work without paying for care they can't afford. These aren't grand political gestures. They're survival strategies born from desperate necessity. But they teach Dorothy and others crucial lessons about collective power, about how ordinary people organizing together can create support systems that institutions ignore, can protect each other when the system offers no protection, can maintain dignity and community even in the depths of crisis. She also becomes involved in the Unemployed Councils, organizations formed by Communist Party organizers, but including people of all political backgrounds, united by the immediate need to resist evictions, demand relief, and fight for jobs programs. The councils organize neighbors to physically prevent evictions by moving furniture back into apartments, by blocking sheriffs from entering homes, by making it socially and politically costly for landlords to throw people into the street. Dorothy participates in her first eviction resistance in early 1933. A widow with 3 children is being evicted for non-payment of rent. She lost her cleaning job months ago and has no income. The Unemployed Council mobilizes dozens of neighbors to the apartment. When the sheriff arrives to carry out the eviction, he finds 50 people blocking the door, linking arms, refusing to move. The confrontation is tense. The sheriff threatens arrests. The crowd threatens to spread word to every neighborhood in the city, to make this landlord infamous, to ensure no one will rent from him. Eventually, after hours of standoff, the landlord agrees to a payment plan. The eviction is postponed, and the widow and her children keep their home. It's a small victory, but it teaches a powerful lesson. Organized people can challenge power, can win concessions, can protect each other through collective action. She also sees the darker side of depression desperation. The rise of scapegoating, of looking for someone to blame for the suffering. African American workers face intensified discrimination as white workers demand they be fired first. Mexican American families are deported en masse, accused of taking jobs from real Americans, despite many being citizens. Jewish shop owners face boycotts and violence fueled by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about who caused the crash. She witnesses how economic crisis can either build solidarity across differences or destroy it through competition and scapegoating. In her neighborhood, organizers consciously work to build multiracial, multi-ethnic solidarity, to frame the struggle as workers versus owners rather than worker versus worker. It's not always successful. Prejudices run deep, and fear makes people tribal. But the effort matters, establishing principles that the labor movement will build on. By mid-1933, Franklin Roosevelt has been inaugurated, promising a New Deal for the American people. The first wave of programs brings immediate relief. The Civilian Conservation Corps, putting young men to work. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, providing direct aid. The National Industrial Recovery Act, promising fair labor standards and collective bargaining rights. Dorothy and Frank both find work through New Deal programs. Frank joins a CCC crew, building roads and parks, earning $30 a month, not much, but enough to contribute to the household,
enough to restore some sense of purpose. Dorothy gets work through a garment workers project, sewing clothing for relief distribution. The relief is enormous, but the jobs are temporary, the pay is minimal, and the programs are chaotic in implementation. Still, for the first time in years, there's hope that the government might actually do something, that the suffering might be acknowledged and addressed rather than ignored. But Dorothy has learned not to rely on government benevolence. The New Deal programs come because of political pressure, because of protests and organising and demands from below. If that pressure stops, the programs will disappear. The fight for permanent change, for fundamental transformation of economic relationships, requires continued organising and struggle.
By 1934, the worst of the immediate crisis has passed, but unemployment remains catastrophically high, wages remain depressed, and working conditions remain brutal for those lucky enough to have jobs. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act theoretically guarantees workers' right to organise and bargain collectively, but employers ignore it with impunity, and the government rarely enforces it. This creates a volatile situation. Workers have been promised rights they don't actually have. They've been told they can organise unions, but when they try, they're fired, blacklisted, beaten. The gap between promise and reality fuels anger and militancy. 1934 becomes the year of strikes, massive labour conflicts that shut down entire cities, that bring workers and employers into violent confrontation, that force the government to choose sides. The Toledo Autolite strike, the Minneapolis Teamsters strike, the San Francisco General strike, and in Dorothy's city, the textile workers strike that will change her life forever. Dorothy has returned to work in a garment factory, but conditions are worse than before the Depression. Wages have been cut by 40%. Hours are long and irregular, with no overtime pay. The speed-up is relentless, with supervisors demanding faster and faster work. Safety equipment is non-existent. Sexual harassment is routine and ignored. Workers are fired for any complaint, with hundreds of desperate unemployed ready to take their place. When union organisers from the Congress of Industrial Organisations approach the factory workers about organising, Dorothy is among the first to sign up. She's learned through her work with the Unemployed Councils that collective action works, that isolated individuals have no power, but organised groups can fight back. The organising campaign is dangerous. The factory owners hire armed guards and private detectives to identify and fire union supporters. Workers suspected of organising are blacklisted, their names shared with other employers to ensure they can never work in the industry again. Union meetings must be held in secret, with elaborate precautions to avoid infiltration. Dorothy becomes a key organiser among the women workers. She's trusted, articulate, fearless in ways that surprise even her. She holds clandestine meetings in her home, recruits new members, argues with sceptical workers that the risk is worth it, that the alternative is continued exploitation without end. By summer of 1934, the union has secretly organised a majority of workers in several garment factories. They present demands to the owners: recognition of the union, a 40-hour work week, a 30% wage increase to restore pre-depression pay, seniority protection, and an end to sexual harassment. The owners refuse to even meet with union representatives. The workers strike. Thousands of garment workers walk out, shutting down production across the city. The owners, backed by the Chamber of Commerce and city government, vow to break the strike. They hire replacement workers. They get court injunctions against picketing. They recruit police to protect strikebreakers entering the factories. The picket lines become battlegrounds. Dorothy and other women workers form the front lines, believing that police and guards will be less likely to attack women. They're wrong. Police use clubs, tear gas, and fists against the women picketers. Dorothy is beaten unconscious during one confrontation, waking in the hospital with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. The violence against women strikers backfires on the owners. Public opinion, which had been neutral or hostile to the strike, shifts. Churches condemn the beatings. Women's organizations rally to support the strikers. The newspapers, eager for dramatic stories, published photographs of police clubbing women, creating sympathy for the workers. The strike drags on for weeks, then months. Striker families survive on strike relief provided by other unions and by community support. The owners bring in strikebreakers, but production is chaotic with inexperienced workers and quality suffers. Both sides are bleeding financially, both are exhausted, but neither will give in. The federal government, under pressure from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who has taken an interest in the strike, finally intervenes. A mediation board is established. After intensive negotiations, a settlement is reached. Union recognition, a modest wage increase, some improvements in conditions, and no retaliation against strikers. It's not everything the workers demanded, but it's a victory. They've established the union, won collective bargaining rights, and proven that garment workers, mostly women, often dismissed as unorganizable, can fight and win. Dorothy, recovering from her injuries, feels a profound sense of accomplishment and purpose. She's helped change not just her workplace, but the labor landscape of her entire city.
The victory in the garment strike is part of a wave of labor militancy sweeping the country in the mid-1930s. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, formed to organize workers across entire industries rather than by craft, launches massive organizing drives in auto, steel, rubber, and other industrial sectors. Union membership explodes from under 3 million in 1933 to over 8 million by 1938. Dorothy becomes a full-time union organizer, paid a small salary by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union to organize women workers across the region. It's exhausting, often dangerous work. She travels to small towns where owners control everything, where union organizers have been run out of town or beaten. She holds secret meetings, builds trust, helps workers find the courage to stand up to employers who seem omnipotent. She also becomes involved in broader political organizing. The union recognizes that workplace organizing alone isn't enough. Workers need political power, need representatives who will pass pro-labor laws, need a government that enforces workers' rights rather than protecting employer interests. Dorothy campaigns for pro-labor candidates, registers voters in working-class neighborhoods, educates workers about how political decisions affect their lives. She learns to see the connections between workplace issues and broader social policies, between union rights and civil rights, between economic justice and political power. The sit-down strikes of 1936 to 1937 represent the peak of Depression-era labor militancy. Instead of walking out and allowing employers to hire replacements, workers stay inside the factories, occupying the space, preventing production, but also preventing strike-breaking. The tactic is brilliant and infuriating to employers, who watch helplessly as their factories sit idle,
occupied by their own workers. Dorothy helps coordinate support for the famous Flint sit-down strike at General Motors. She's not in the occupied factory. The sit-down strikers are mostly men, but she organizes the Women's Emergency Brigade, women who support the strike by bringing food, forming auxiliary picket lines, and most dramatically, breaking factory windows to let in fresh air when police use tear gas against the occupiers. The Flint strike lasts 44 days and ends in complete victory. GM recognizes the United Auto Workers Union and agrees to collective bargaining. It's a watershed moment that leads to organizing successes across the auto industry and beyond. The CIO uses the momentum to organize steel, rubber, electrical, and other industries, fundamentally transforming American labor relations. But the victories come at a cost. Dorothy's marriage to Frank, strained by years of depression hardship, finally breaks under the pressure of her organizing work. Frank, who never fully recovered psychologically from his unemployment, resents her increasing prominence and frequent absences. He wants her to be a traditional housewife, to focus on home and family. She can't go back to that life, not after discovering her capacity for leadership and her commitment to the movement. They divorce in 1937, a decision that brings Dorothy both relief and sadness. She's 32 years old, childless, unmarried, living in a boarding house, earning barely enough to survive. By conventional measures, she should be a failure, but she feels more alive, more purposeful than ever before. She's helping build a movement that's changing the country, that's winning real power for working people, that's creating the possibility of a different future. The late 1930s see the consolidation of New Deal reforms and labor gains. The Social Security Act provides old age pensions and unemployment insurance. The Fair Labor Standards Act establishes a minimum wage, maximum hours, and prohibits most child labor. The Wagner Act protects union organizing and requires employers to bargain in good faith. These reforms, won through political pressure from organized labor and progressive movements, create the basic framework of the American welfare state. Dorothy understands these victories aren't permanent unless they're defended. Conservative forces, represented by business interests and their political allies, immediately begin working to roll back reforms, to weaken unions, to restrict the gains workers have won. The fight isn't over, it's ongoing, requiring constant vigilance and organization. She also grapples with the limitations and contradictions of the labor movement. Many unions remain segregated, excluding African American workers or relegating them to second-class membership. Women workers, despite their crucial role in strikes and organizing, are often marginalized in union leadership. The movement's focus on industrial workers leaves out agricultural workers, domestic workers, and other sectors with large numbers of Black, Latino, and Asian American workers. She works within her union to address these issues, pushing for integration, for women's leadership, for solidarity across racial and ethnic lines. It's slow, frustrating work, confronting prejudices even among people who should know better, fighting battles within the movement while also fighting external enemies. But she persists, believing that the labor movement can only succeed if it represents all workers, if it fights for justice broadly rather than for narrow group interests.
The approach of World War II transforms the economic and political landscape yet again. Defense spending begins in the late 1930s, even before the US enters the war. Factories that have been closed or operating at partial capacity suddenly receive massive government contracts. Unemployment, which has remained stubbornly high throughout the Depression, finally begins to fall significantly. By 1941, when the U.S. enters the war after Pearl Harbor, the economy is transforming into a full war production machine. Factories operate around the clock. Labor shortages replace unemployment. Women and African Americans are recruited into industrial jobs they were previously excluded from. The economic desperation of the Depression gives way to economic opportunity, though under the intense pressure of wartime mobilization. Dorothy, now in her late 30s, watches these transformations with mixed feelings. The economic suffering is ending, which is good. People have jobs, have incomes, have security they haven't known in over a decade. But the improvements come through military spending and war, not through the economic restructuring she and others had hoped for. The New Deal reforms remain, but the more radical transformations many had envisioned, public ownership of key industries, comprehensive economic planning, true economic democracy, are abandoned in favor of a government-industry partnership focused on war production. She continues her union work, now focused on maintaining labor standards during wartime. The government pressures unions to accept a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war, arguing that strikes interfere with essential war production. Many unions accept this, but it creates tensions as employers use the no-strike pledge to push for speed-ups, extended hours, and weakened safety protections. Dorothy finds herself mediating between union members frustrated with working conditions and a national union leadership committed to the no-strike pledge. She understands both perspectives. The war effort is real, and fascism poses a genuine threat that requires all-out mobilization. But workers shouldn't be expected to abandon their rights and protections completely. Shouldn't be asked to sacrifice while corporations make record profits from government contracts. She also becomes involved in civil rights organizing, recognizing that the war for democracy abroad requires confronting racism at home. The Double V campaign, Victory Over Fascism Abroad and Over Racism at Home, articulates what many black workers have been saying all along. You can't fight for freedom overseas while denying it to millions of Americans. Dorothy works with A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement, which threatens a massive protest in Washington to demand desegregation of defense industries and the military. The threatened march pushes President Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 8802, prohibiting discrimination in defense industries. It's a significant victory, though enforcement is weak and discrimination continues in practice. The war years also see massive internal migration. African Americans move from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, seeking defense jobs and escaping Jim Crow. Mexican workers are recruited through the Bracero program to fill agricultural labor shortages. Women enter the industrial workforce in unprecedented numbers. These demographic shifts create both opportunities and tensions as communities navigate rapid change and competition for housing and resources. Dorothy works to build solidarity across these differences, to help newly arrived migrants connect with unions and community organizations, to fight discrimination in housing and employment. It's hard work, often unsuccessful, but she persists because the alternative, allowing workers to be divided by race, gender, and ethnicity, means defeat. The war ends in 1945 with the defeat of fascism, but the return of peace brings new uncertainties. Defense contracts are cancelled. Factories convert back to civilian production, often with significant layoffs. Millions of veterans return home seeking jobs in an economy that's contracting. Women who took factory jobs during the war are pushed back into domestic roles to make room for male veterans. The question of what the post-war economy will look like remains unsettled. Dorothy, now 50, has been organizing for over 15 years. Her body shows the wear. Old injuries from picket line confrontations, stress-related health problems, the exhaustion of constant struggle. But she's also accumulated knowledge, skills and networks that make her invaluable to the movement. She's a mentor to younger organizers, a repository of institutional memory, a strategist who understands both the possibilities and limitations of different tactics.
The post-war years see both consolidation of labour's gains and the beginning of long-term challenges that will eventually weaken the movement. Union membership continues growing through the late 1940s and 1950s, reaching its peak in the mid-1950s at about 35% of the workforce. The Labour Management Accord creates relative industrial peace, with unions gaining security and predictable wage increases in exchange for accepting management's control over production and giving up more radical demands. Dorothy works through these years as a regional education director for her union, teaching labour history and organising skills to new generations of union members. She sees the benefits of the accord: steadily rising wages, expanding benefits, the growth of the white working class into middle-class security. But she also sees the limitations and emerging problems. The accord depends on sustained economic growth that begins showing signs of stress. Automation eliminates jobs in unionized industries. Manufacturing begins moving to the south and eventually overseas, seeking lower wages and fewer regulations. The unions, having focused narrowly on workplace issues rather than broader social transformation, find themselves defending gains rather than advancing toward new victories. She also watches the labour movement fail to organise the growing service sector, fail to adapt to economic changes, fail to maintain solidarity across racial and ethnic lines as white workers move to suburbs and black and Latino workers remain in deindustrializing cities. The seeds of labour's eventual decline are visible even in the period of its greatest apparent success. Dorothy retires in 1962 at age 57, her health finally demanding she step back from the constant travel and stress of organizing work. She moves to a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, living on a modest union pension and social security, both benefits that exist because of struggles she participated in. She spends her retirement writing memoirs, speaking to student groups, staying involved in local activism. She watches the civil rights movement of the 1960s and sees echoes of the organizing strategies she learned in the 1930s.
the sit-ins, the mass mobilizations, the willingness to face violence for justice. She supports anti-war organizing during Vietnam, recognizing the connections between militarism abroad and poverty at home. She lives to see the 1970s, when the post-war economic order begins cracking seriously, when deindustrialization accelerates, when unions begin declining in membership and power. She watches with frustration as many of the hard-won gains of her youth are slowly eroded, as workers' share of economic growth shrinks, as inequality begins increasing dramatically. But she also sees continuity in struggle. New generations of organizers are building new movements. Farm workers under Cesar Chavez, public sector unions, community organizing in poor neighborhoods. The specific forms change, the targets and tactics evolve, but the fundamental dynamics remain. Organized people can challenge concentrated power. Collective action can win concessions. Solidarity is stronger than isolation. Dorothy dies in 1979 at age 74, having lived through the Great Depression, the labor wars, World War II, the post-war boom, and the beginning of economic restructuring. Her life spanned an era of tremendous change, much of it driven by people like her who refused to accept suffering as inevitable, who organized for something better, who built institutions and movements that improved millions of lives. At her funeral, old union comrades and young activists alike gather to honor her. They tell stories of strikes she organized, workers she helped, victories she contributed to. They acknowledge that the world she helped create is under attack, that the gains are being rolled back, that the struggle continues. But they also celebrate what was accomplished, the basic protections that workers take for granted: minimum wage, overtime pay, workplace safety standards, unemployment insurance, social security, the right to organize, exist because of people like Dorothy. The 8-hour day and the weekend, the concept that workers have rights and dignity, the principle that economic power should be balanced by organized labor power, these ideas, now seemingly obvious, were fought for and won by ordinary people doing extraordinary things.
As you drift into sleep tonight, think about Dorothy and the millions like her who lived through the Great Depression. Think about how they endured, not just with passive suffering, but with organization, with solidarity, with the determination to build something better from the ruins of economic collapse. The Depression taught a generation that individual effort alone isn't enough, that the system can fail catastrophically, that survival requires collective action and mutual aid. Those lessons, learned in the hardest possible way, shaped the social programs and labor protections we still depend on today. Every time you collect unemployment benefits, every time you receive Social Security, every time workplace safety regulations protect you, every time you work a 40-hour week with overtime pay, you're benefiting from struggles that Dorothy and millions of others fought in the 1930s. They didn't know if they would win. They faced overwhelming power, violence, and the constant threat of destitution. But they organized anyway. They struck anyway. They built power from below anyway. The Great Depression was a catastrophe, but from it came profound social transformation. Not because leaders were enlightened, not because the system reformed itself, but because ordinary people organized and demanded change, because they recognized that solidarity is survival, because they refused to accept suffering as inevitable. As you rest tonight, know that we face our own challenges. Inequality is returning to pre-depression levels. Unions have declined. Social programs are under attack. Economic security feels increasingly fragile. But Dorothy's story reminds us that change is possible, that organized people have power, that solidarity works. The long nights of the Depression were filled with suffering, but also with organizing, with building, with creating the foundations of a more just economy. That work is never finished. Every generation must fight for justice anew, must organize against exploitation anew, must build solidarity anew. Sleep well, night wanderers. Rest knowing that you're part of a long tradition of people who refused to accept injustice, who organized for something better, who built the world we live in through struggle and solidarity. And remember Dorothy, 24 years old when the Depression hit, 57 when she retired, 74 when she died, having spent her life fighting for working people, having helped build a movement that changed America forever. Her story isn't boring history. It's the story of how ordinary people survive catastrophe and build something better from the ruins of economic collapse. Sweet dreams. And remember, every right we have, every protection, every bit of security, someone fought for it, organized for it, sometimes died for it. Their struggle continues in us. Rest well.